Welcome to the Propertybuyer Podcast, where we explore the world of residential and commercial real estate to help you make better decisions about buying, selling, or investing in all types of property. Join me, Rich Harvey, CEO of propertybuyer.com.au and multi-award-winning buyer's advocate. Our podcast features expert interviews, market trends and insights, and practical tips for navigating the complex world of Australian real estate. Whether you're a home buyer, a seasoned property investor, commercial buyer, developer, or simply curious about the property market, our podcast is for you. Join us as we share our knowledge, strategies, and experience and help you achieve your property goals. Welcome to our next edition of the Propertybuyer Podcast. Now, Melbourne has recently overtaken Sydney as Australia's most populated city. It's Australia's cultural capital with many famous international sporting events, think Australian Open, Formula One Grand Prix, and wonderful cafes and restaurants, and a terrific, vibrant nightlife. What are the prospects for long-term capital growth in Melbourne? Will population growth and infrastructure lead to stronger returns? So to uncover the most recent opportunities and hotspots in this amazing capital, today I've got Terry Ryder, Managing Director of hotspotting.com, with us to share his amazing insights today. Welcome, Terry.
Great to be here, Rich. Love talking about real estate, but I particularly like talking about Melbourne.
Fantastic. Well, Terry, we've got a tradition on our podcast, and I'm going to throw you our thought of the week. And it's by a famous author called Mark Twain. And here's his quote. He says, 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things that you didn't do than by the ones you did do. So throw off the bow lines, sail away from the safe harbour, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, discover. What do you take from that quote?
Oh, the first thing is that I think that I've read more wonderful quotes from Mark Twain than any other person who's ever lived on planet Earth. He's a genius, that guy. But what I take from that, there's something you want to do, make a plan, go for it, do it. Too many people are, I think, wait and see people. They procrastinate and, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they still haven't done what they really wanted to do. Find your passion, follow it, do it.
Yeah, I think people get to the end of their careers or in their 50s and 60s and realise, gosh, I wish I'd done this. And, they wish they'd asked themselves, what should I have told my 25-year-old self? And I think this quote is very much about explore, dream, discover. Throw off the bow lines, take a risk, have a crack, as we say in Australia.
Yeah,
have a crack. Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, I've got some questions for you. Now, Terry, you've been a long-term commentator on the property market. Tell us, I guess, how you got into that field doing commentary and journalism, and what generated your interest firstly in the property market?
Well, actually, when I started, I didn't have any interest in the property market. I was a newspaper journalist, and one day the editor of the Courier Mail in Brisbane called me into his office and said, "We've decided to make you property editor." And I said, "Really? I don't know anything about real estate." And he said, "You'll find out."
Great.
Which says something about the way media runs in this country. But I thought that if I'm going to have to do the job, then I'm going to find out about the subject, and a specialty evolved from there. A few years later, they tried to move me out of that position, and I said, "No, I'm just starting to really get good at this. Leave me there, and I want to stay and get really as good as I can get on this subject." So it became a kind of a lifetime specialty.
Fantastic. And you worked for The Australian as well for many years, I believe?
Well, I worked for the Financial Review, and I wrote columns for The Australian for a number of years.
I used to read them avidly. They were excellent. I loved your bit of cynicism and pithiness and, I guess, strong independence that you would bring to your articles. It was excellent.
Yeah, and it resulted in me losing that gig with The Australian because it's a newspaper where your comments have to be aligned politically correctly, otherwise it's not acceptable, and I was being censored. And so I said, nah, I'm not doing it anymore. If I can't express my own views, I don't want to do it. It was a bit of a wrench because it was great for profile and it was very well paid, but I couldn't abide the censorship.
Good on you for standing up to your principles. So our topic today is Melbourne. How do you think of the Melbourne market? What sort of adjectives would you use to describe Melbourne?
As a city?
As a city.
I love Melbourne. So European, I think it's the most European in Australia. I love Europe, and I think Melbourne has got European flavour to it. It's not like Sydney with, iconic buildings. It's just something about the vibe of Melbourne, the lifestyle, the fabric of it. I think it's a fantastic place. Definitely my favourite Australian city. Always looking for excuses to go there so I can have a tax-deductible trip to Melbourne.
Fantastic. Every time I go down there, it's like, what new restaurant can I try?
It's fantastic for food.
Foodie world is just great, isn't it? Yeah.
Plus my wife was born and bred there, and one of my daughters is actually living there, so lots of reasons to go to Melbourne.
Great. Do you know the current population of Melbourne?
Look, I don't exactly know. I do know it's now the biggest city in Australia. I think they kind of redefined where our cities start and end. I mean, it's 5 or 6 million. It's substantial, and it's overtaken Sydney according to the definitions of the cities that are now applied by the ABS.
Can you share any kind of trends that you're seeing that are sort of shaping the Melbourne property market, like in terms of price growth, rental yields, or buyer demographics at the moment?
Yeah, a couple of things. Melbourne started last year, the start of 2023, as a struggling market, but as the year wore on, it got stronger and stronger in terms of sales activity. And by the end of the year, it was really quite vibrant, lots of buyer activity, but it hadn't really translated into price growth yet, the way it had in, say, Sydney and Brisbane. So my expectation is that in 2024, we're going to see better, higher price growth in Melbourne than we saw in 2023. So that's one thing. The other thing that really struck me was the latest vacancy rate figures, I think published by PropTrack. And all the capital cities had a small reduction, continuing that trend of tighter and tighter vacancies, which has been a national issue for some time. But Melbourne had this big drop from like 1.5% to 1% in a short period of time. And I think that's indicative of the fact that some investors have sold out of the market because they're finding the state government not so friendly.
Interesting. We'll come back to that in a minute. But and what about sort of the different rings around the city? You've got the inner city market, the middle ring suburbs and the outer suburbs. How do you think perhaps each of those sub-markets is performing in Melbourne at the moment?
Well, in terms of the activity, they were all really pumping as we got to the end of last year. One of the trends that interested us the most was in Melbourne with apartment demand, and that's a national trend that we're seeing right across the country in the big cities. We're seeing better performance from apartment markets. That old paradigm that houses on land show better capital growth. That's being challenged now more and more. We're finding more and more locations where apartments are actually starting to outperform houses in the same location. And inner Melbourne is one of those places where there's very strong demand from buyers, different cohorts. But the outer ring areas have come back strongly as well because they offer a greater level of affordability. All the sectors seem to be pumping quite well in Melbourne at the moment.
We recently just bought an investment apartment for an expat client in just overlooking Albert Park in Melbourne, and we got an investor a beautiful two-bedroom, really large two-bedroom apartment. It was about 100 square metres internally, beautifully finished, about 5 years old. We paid $650 for it, and we're getting $700 a week in rent, and that's just fantastic.
Yeah, that's the sort of investment I think more and more wannabe investors need to be aware of, that you can achieve results like a great location, affordable price for many people, good rental return, and because it's an apartment with some individual quality, it's not like one of 300 in a high-rise block.
Correct.
It's got some potential for growth. So
it was one of about 28 in the block, so it's not a massive block.
That sounds to me like the quintessential apartment investment in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, we're noticing too that the inner city, all of the different rings of the market are performing quite differently. We're seeing a lot of the home buyers wanting to actually get back in toward the city, where it's really got as you said, talk about the vibe and getting access to all of the amenities. But you've also got the pockets down on the Bayside, the southeast sector, down toward Frankston and those areas. That's also really popular for families and investors. And you can still buy houses there for well under $1 million and still be within 40 minutes of the CBD of Melbourne.
And you've got access to the bay. Frankston is a bayside suburb with good transport links back to central Melbourne.
That's it. So let's talk about Melbourne price growth. I did the numbers, so you didn't have to sort of come up on the spot with it, but over the last 25 years, I took the median house price and analysed it. And back in 2003, the median house price was $315,693. Today, it's roughly around $1 million. So the average growth over the last 25 years has been 7.4%. So it's been pretty consistent, pretty similar to Sydney, around 7.5%. So when you average out the mean or the average of those prices, how have you seen price growth, say, the last 5 to 10 years, particularly over the COVID phase?
That's a pretty good average, isn't it? And you'd be happy with that if you bought something 25 years ago and had done that. In the last 5 years, well, 2020, when we were told prices were going to collapse, they didn't. And Melbourne showed moderate growth. And then 2021, like a lot of other places, huge growth, above 20%. 2022 was a year in which Melbourne sort of subsided for various reasons. And in 2023, we saw the market starting to come back in terms of activity, but prices didn't grow a lot. So it was like, according to CoreLogic, sort of 3 or 4%.
Yeah, I think it was 3.1% last year. So I think it's really been an underperformer, 3.1 or something last year.
And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me that it had such low price growth compared to some of the other cities, because the activity really did pick up strongly. And so that's why I think that Melbourne is probably going to do better in 2024 because it kind of underachieved in 2023.
There's a lot of talk in the media, just a lot of negativity around Melbourne's performance compared to other capital cities like Brisbane, Gold Coast. What do you think sort of driving that commentary around that negativity? And do you think that's just conjecture, or do you think actually people are shying away from Melbourne?
I think the negativity is about the behaviour of the state government. It's not about the city, and it's not about the market. There's the state government. Don't want to dwell too much on politics, but in my view, the state government of Victoria has been and still is the most investor unfriendly state or territory government in the country. And they've got a budget problem. They're trying to milk the real estate industry for revenue, and investors are always a popular target. So I think that's where the negativity, cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. I mean, who does that? Particularly after you only 12 months ago you applied for it and got it, and then you turn around and just cancel it, claiming that the cost of running it has risen from $2 billion to $7 billion in 12 months. I mean, I think it's created a bad vibe that doesn't really, it's not really justified, because Melbourne and Victoria is one of the strongest economies in the country. It's got wonderful population growth boosted by overseas migrants, great lifestyle, particularly in regional Victoria. A lot to recommend it, but it's getting a bad vibe from its government.
Yeah, I mean, that's the leads into my next question about just how much the Victorian government has increased land taxes, particularly. I mean, I own property down there, and they've increased our land tax by about, I can't remember, it's going to be about 10%, 15% more this year. And it's like, I look at it and go, is it worth it? And for me, yes, I'm just going to hold it. I'm not going to react negatively and just sell my property just because I don't like the taxes going up. But they are an easy target, property investors. But what impact do you think it's having on not just investor psyche, but the investment property market in Melbourne?
Well, it's not helping at all, and it's bad news for tenants in Melbourne and Victoria. Some people will be able to absorb it. It's not just land tax. I mean, they've come up with new taxes, vacant land tax, and they've increased stamp duty, and investors are always targeted. Some investors who have already had to accommodate rising interest rates and rising insurance costs and rising council rates, everything's gone up. Rising taxes from the state government can be the tipping point for some people. So we just can't afford it. We're already on a tight budget as a family. We can't afford to be tipping money into our investment property, so they'll sell it. And I think the record shows that there have been a lot of investors selling out of Victoria in the last 12 months.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's going to have a real detrimental effect on the volume of investors, hence the volume of rental stock in Victoria. Yeah. So as you say, we already have a rental crisis, and I think taking a cheap shot at just trying to increase the tax revenue is going to backfire on the government.
It's very short-sighted, because they haven't thought through the consequences. The people who are going to suffer ultimately will be, people who need to rent, like
Exactly.
a third of their constituents.
That's right.
We really appreciate you tuning in to the Property Buyer Podcast, and I hope that you're finding our expert interviews helpful. So that we can keep providing this information and growing our audience, we rely on word of mouth recommendations. If you found this information useful, could I please ask you to share this podcast with your friends, family and colleagues, and ask them to subscribe to the Property Buyer Podcast. It would be a big help, and we'd be very grateful for your support. Thanks once again for sharing the links. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
Just one last question on land tax. We're seeing land tax also having an impact on the prestige market, areas like Brighton, Hampton and Beaumaris. And we're seeing that the rental income that would typically be obtained from some of these properties is nowhere near enough to cover the costs. But do you think that this land tax is really going to deter wealthy owners or overseas buyers? Do you think they're going to turn around and sell their properties, or do you think it's just going to be, what a pain, we'll just bear it?
Well, I think that the wealthy can probably absorb it because they'll probably comfort at the fact that in the long term they're going to do pretty well out of capital growth. And they may have the financial capacity to absorb those extra costs. It's the people down the chain, the $500,000 type investors that can't sustain those increases in taxes. So those wealthy suburbs, not so much, I would expect.
I want to delve into your hotspotting brain for a minute. And are there any particular pockets of Melbourne that you think are primed for capital growth relative to other areas? And perhaps what might be the drivers of those areas?
Yeah, well, again, some of the inner city apartment markets, well located apartments with individual character. We're not talking about the Docklands of this world. Avoid those ones. But so we're just seeing an uplift in demand in those areas, and it's about lifestyle, it's about location, it's about affordability. There's all sorts of cohorts that for whom the apartment lifestyle suits, downsizers and people starting out, people who like to lock up and leave, low maintenance lifestyle, migrants who come from countries where that style of living is the norm. So certainly, there are inner city suburbs like, I suppose, like the Hawthorn type suburbs where you might be paying $2 million for the average house, but you can buy a decent apartment for $600,000 or $700,000. There's quite a difference there. So you access that location and lifestyle for a much lower price. So that's one. Some of the outer ring areas close to big employment nodes, like a city of Hume, sort of in the north suburbs like Sunbury, affordable for a lot of people. It feels like it's a long way out, but contrary to the popular myth, most people don't work in the CBD. Most people work in suburban jobs nodes, and there's a lot of big employment nodes up in the north of Melbourne. So those sorts of areas, I think, are going to get ongoing demand for those reasons.
Okay. Are there any other big infrastructure projects that are earmarked or in progress happening in Melbourne, and what impact do you think they might have on the property market in the next decade?
Yeah, there are a lot of quite big ones, controversial. The circular rail link. The numbers keep changing. Whatever they say it's going to cost in the beginning, you can double it probably, but it's $60 billion. That's a massive project, very influential. Just the spending of that sort of money generates so much economic activity and employment. Then you've got airport rail. It's all mostly transport infrastructure, but there's also some medical, like the new heart hospital. I really like that Monash, city of Monash precinct. They've already got university campus, medical facilities, the new heart hospital, really nice suburbs, sort of middle ring. Not too far from the centre of town, good transport links, lots of green spaces. Yeah, I like areas like that. And, new significant new infrastructure projects like a major new hospital can generate a lot, because it's not just thousands of jobs in building it, there's thousands of jobs in running it once it's finished.
Exactly.
So that kind of infrastructure is really influential long term.
Yeah, I really like the idea of like that area in Monash where you've got not just medical, but other facilities supporting that. And I think I've noticed, particularly around infrastructure announcements, you get a little spike when it's announced, and then you get an even bigger spike after it's all implemented and people actually realise the travel saving times or what the infrastructure provides in that area. It's quite amazing. Yeah. Are there any other areas of Melbourne you might recommend for investors that perhaps we haven't thought about yet?
I kind of like those sort of inner or mid-northern suburbs, like Northcote, Preston, those sorts of areas which have been in the past. I'm always looking out for the ugly ducklings, the ones that have at one point been considered to be down market, and they become discovered, gentrified, they become trendy, and they're transformed and their values are transformed. So places like North Coast, Preston and nearby suburbs, they've got lots of sort of ethnic character and all sorts of different types of restaurants and but not too far out from the centre of town, serviced by trains and trams and all the things that Melbourne offers. So I do like looking for those little sort of hidden gems that
fantastic
can be transformed.
Excellent. On the flip side of that, are there any dark areas that you'd say are a no-go, where there's just way too much housing commission, or areas that are just going to flatline for the next 10 years that investors, you say that's a no-go zone?
I think really only those sort of high-rise apartments, sort of, the Docklands, South Bank, where they just, they can just throw up, half a dozen more 30 or 40-storey buildings, and they're just full of hundreds of generic apartments, all the same. Avoid those. But apart from that, Melbourne's got so many different qualities. You've got Bayside suburbs, you've got the swanky sort of inner southeast. You've got sort of underrated areas like some of the ones we've just talked about, heading out to the east, sort of middle ring areas that don't get talked about much, but have nice lifestyle, lots of green space, lots of different qualities on offer in Melbourne, and something to suit most budgets.
Excellent. We often get asked at Propertybuyer, just a lot of our investors go, well, look, just thinking about Melbourne as a whole, I've got, 700, a million, 800, 1.5 to invest, whatever the number is. And they go, Rich, tell us, where should I invest that money? Why is Melbourne better than Brisbane, or Brisbane better than Melbourne, or Sydney better than Melbourne? What's your view on how do you compare the prospects for capital growth, particularly in Melbourne compared to other capital cities? And what would be your advice to investors?
Yeah, look, there's no one right answer to the question. That's the problem. And
that's the right answer. And that's the correct answer as well.
That's right. The answer depends on the individual.
Exactly.
What they already own. It's all about developing a well-rounded portfolio with geographical diversity to it. So you don't want all your properties in Melbourne. You certainly buy in Melbourne if you've already, you've got Brisbane properties and Sydney properties and Perth properties. Melbourne might give more balance to your property portfolio. There might be an opening there. I wouldn't say that its prospects for long-term capital growth is any better than a Sydney or Brisbane. I think they're good, but not necessarily the best in the country.
Well, I did an analysis, and it's on my website. I did an article on property prices in 2043. What are they going to be in 10 years' time or 9 years' time compared to the last 25 years? And we've already covered that, Melbourne's averaged 7.4% over the last 25 years. So even if you're looking forward, it's really a bit of a moot point as to whether you invest in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Gold Coast, wherever. In the sense that if you are building a portfolio, it's good to have multiple properties and have exposure to different cities, because the tax rates are going to change over time, right? And we might find there's another government gets into Melbourne and reduces the land tax. It might be they have more favourable structure. There might be a zoning change. There could be all sorts of things happen, and it's good to have exposure to different markets, particularly also if you're looking to sell your property at some point down the track. And if you've got all your properties in one market, you might be stuck in selling in a down market as well.
But something to think about there is, cities like Melbourne, they have to increase density. They can't just keep sprawling out. And that's something to keep in mind, that owning real estate, in those inner and middle ring areas could be profitable long term because zonings will have to change, densities will have to increase, councils will have to be dragged kicking and screaming to that. We're going through that process in Sydney at the moment with the current state government. But there's an inevitability about it because the only alternative is just this incredible ongoing urban sprawl and all the costs that brings to bear with new infrastructure and rail links and road links. Greater density makes more sense.
Excellent. Terry, my last question for you. What are some common myths or misconceptions about the Melbourne property market that you'd like to educate our listeners on?
I can't think of one. Can you?
I think, okay, well, you're throwing the question straight back at me. Well, I think a lot of people think of Melbourne as one market. And I think there's so many beautiful different types of properties in Melbourne. You do have the inner city market. You've got some beautiful Victorian terraces, in Carlton or Fitzroy. You've got some beachfront properties, right from Brighton, and then look at the real expensive stuff down at Sorrento and Portsea, where a lot of people own holiday homes. So I think the myth is that Melbourne prices are just one market. So I think that's the first thing to clear up. There's a multitude of opportunities for investors or home buyers to get a good slice of Australia in the Melbourne market as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a comment I made earlier that there's something for everyone in Melbourne, all sorts of different lifestyles and different price points. It is a very varied city, and you can access lifestyle certainly more affordably than you can in Sydney, for example. I can't think of an equivalent to, say, Frankston in Sydney, where you can buy in a bayside suburb, at a price that a first-home buyer can afford. And then you've got the Mornington Peninsula, which actually had an incredible growth.
Well, I think the only equivalent would actually be out of Sydney, which is the Central Coast. Right? Yeah. If you think of sort of waterfront or near waterfront, but having a median price just under $1 million.
Yeah. But then you also go down towards, heading towards Geelong, depending on whether you consider Geelong to be part of Melbourne or regional, doesn't matter really. I mean, it's very accessible, very strong market, continues to show growth, very strong economy, lots of jobs, much more affordable than Melbourne, but it's a peninsula, so great access to a water-based lifestyle there. And a little bit further up, heading up through the Wyndham City, we've got Point Cook and Werribee, with access to lifestyle, but at prices that maybe first-home buyers can afford.
I mean, just the last anecdote I'll finish with, I bought a property in Melbourne back in 2000 and, I'm trying to remember the year now, 2005, 2006 for about $530,000. I bought a 3-bedroom plus study townhouse in North Carlton, and I've still got it today. And its value today is about 1.65. It's got views of the city, and I'm getting, trying to think of the number now, 1,000. No, I'm not. I'm actually getting 1,100 a week for it. So it's a great investment. Never had a problem renting it. It's walking distance to Lygon Street, all the pasta and the Italian places there. It's wonderful. Walk to the university. So it's been a great long-term buy and hold.
It's a fantastic location, isn't it? The hospitals, precinct, university campuses, Lygon Street, not far from the CBD. Not a bad location.
No, that's great. Yeah. Well, Terry, thank you so much for giving us your insights into the topic on why invest in Melbourne, and we look forward to catching up with you again soon. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us on the Propertybuyer Podcast, and we look forward to connecting with you again very soon. Please reach out if you've got any questions. And that's all for us for now. Bye for now.
Thanks for being with us on another Property Buyer podcast. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please click on the SpeakPipe link and we'll answer this during the next episode. If you're looking to buy a residential or commercial property in the near future and would like to get the added advantage of having a buyer's advocate on your side, then please reach out to my team today and send us your inquiry, and we'd be delighted to help. Please visit our website at propertybuyer.com.au, where you can stay updated with all my latest market updates, weekly blogs, and live suburb profiles to help you make better property decisions. We look forward to connecting with you again on the next Property Buyer Podcast.